The velvet box had been sitting in Adrian Hayes' desk drawer for 3 weeks, and he'd opened it so many times to check the ring was still there that the hinge had started to squeak. He closed it one more time, slipped it into his jacket pocket, and looked around the small office that had once been a storage closet before he'd converted it into the headquarters of Hayes Innovations, his company, built from nothing, without a single dollar of his family's money. "You're doing the thing again," said his business partner Ray, glancing up from his laptop. "The pocket padding thing. You've checked that ring 4 times in the last hour." "I want it to be perfect," Adrian said. "It will be. Sophia's going to say yes before you even finish the sentence." Ray grinned. "Assuming, of course, tonight's gala doesn't implode first. How's the Meridian contract looking?" Adrian's smile faltered, just slightly. "Slower than it should be. A few of our logistics partners pulled out this week. Nothing we can't handle." He didn't mention that 3 different vendors had canceled within the same 48 hours, all citing vague internal restructuring. All of them companies that, coincidentally, did business with Hayes Group, his father's empire, and by extension, his stepbrother Damien's domain. Adrian had learned a long time ago not to look too closely at coincidences involving Damien. It only ever led to headaches he didn't have the resources to fight. He'd grown up in that shadow his entire life, the second son of Victor Hayes's second marriage, the one who had to earn every scrap of approval while Damien inherited his simply by existing. Adrian used to resent it. Somewhere along the way, he'd decided resentment was a luxury he couldn't afford, and had instead poured every ounce of that energy into building something that was entirely, undeniably his own. Tonight, he told himself, none of that mattered. Tonight was about Sophia. He'd loved her since their second year of college, the only person he'd always believed who saw him as more than the other Hayes son. She'd stood by him through years of ramen dinners and maxed-out credit cards while he built Hayes Innovations from a laptop in his apartment. She'd told him, more times than he could count, that she didn't care about the Hayes fortune, that she loved him for exactly who he was. Tonight, at the Hayes family's annual charity gala, in front of everyone who had ever doubted him, Adrian planned to ask her to marry him. He straightened his tie in the mirror, checked the ring one final time, and told himself that whatever was happening with the Meridian contract could wait until tomorrow. Across the office, unnoticed by either of them, a silent notification blinked on Ray's monitor. Another vendor withdrawal, this one from a supplier so small it barely registered. Adrian didn't see it. He was already halfway out the door, walking toward the single worst night of his life without the faintest idea of what was waiting for him. The Grand Imperial Hotel's ballroom shimmered with the particular brightness reserved for events where photographs mattered more than conversation. Adrian moved through the crowd with the ring weighing heavier in his pocket with every step, nodding politely to Hayes' family associates who had spent years looking through him rather than at him. He found Sophia near the champagne service, radiant in deep emerald silk, laughing at something one of Damien's business associates had said. She turned as Adrian approached, and something in her expression, a flicker he couldn't quite name, made his chest tighten before she'd even said a word. "Adrian." Her voice was warm, but there was a formality underneath it that hadn't been there a month ago. "I didn't think you'd actually come tonight, given everything happening with your company." "What do you mean, everything happening?" Adrian asked carefully. Sophia's eyes flicked just briefly toward Damien, who stood a few feet away in an impeccable charcoal suit, watching the exchange with the faint, satisfied smile of a man who already knew how the evening would end. "You should ask him," Sophia said quietly. Adrian felt the room tilt slightly, the champagne fountain and the string quartet and 300 watching faces all receding into a kind of underwater blur. He'd come here with a ring in his pocket and a speech he'd rehearsed in the mirror for a week, and some instinct too late and too slow was only now telling him that he'd walked into an ambush wearing a tuxedo. "Sophia," he said, "what's going on?" She reached into her small clutch and withdrew something small, tossing it onto the floor between them with a soft, deliberate motion. His grandmother's ring. The one he had given her freshman year. Before Hayes Innovations existed, before any of this. A promise ring, worn thin with age, the only thing of real sentimental value he'd ever owned. "I'm done pretending this is enough for me, Adrian," Sophia said, her voice rising just enough to carry to the surrounding guests, who had already begun to notice, already begun to turn. "I'm sorry, I really am, but I can't keep living a life where I'm always waiting for enough to finally be enough." "Sophia, I've chosen Damien," she said, and the words landed like something physical, a blow he felt in his teeth. "He can give me the life I actually deserve, the life we both know you never could." Damien stepped forward then, sliding an arm around Sophia's waist with the easy confidence of a man claiming something he'd always considered rightfully his. "Sorry, little brother," Damien said, and there wasn't a trace of sorry in his voice at all. "But you had to know this was coming eventually. Some men are built to inherit empires, others just aren't." The ballroom had gone fully silent now. 300 faces turned toward the center of the room, phones already rising discreetly to capture the moment for tomorrow's headlines. Adrian stood frozen, the ring box still in his pocket, his grandmother's discarded promise ring lying on the marble floor between his shoes, and the woman he'd built his entire adult life around. He didn't reach for it. He couldn't make his hands move at all. Somewhere in the crowd, he heard someone laugh, not cruelly, just the reflexive, uncomfortable laugh of people watching a car crash they couldn't look away from. Adrian Hayes stood in the middle of the grand imperial ballroom and understood, with a clarity that felt like drowning, that whatever life he thought he'd built for himself over the last 4 years had just been publicly, deliberately erased. Nobody moved to help him. That was the detail Adrian would remember most clearly afterward. Not Sophia's words, not Damien's arm around her waist, but the sheer collective stillness of a room full of people who had known him for years and chose, unanimously, to simply watch. His father found him first, which Adrian would later understand was not an act of concern. "Adrian." Victor Hayes's voice was low, clipped, more embarrassed than sympathetic. "Not here. Not in front of everyone." "Not in front of everyone?" Adrian's voice cracked, disbelief bleeding through the humiliation. I saw what happened." Victor glanced around at the watching crowd, his expression tightening with the particular discomfort of a man more concerned with his family's image than his son's collapsing evening. "Come with me, now." He led Adrian toward a private lounge off the main ballroom, and by the time the door closed behind them, half the Hayes family had already gathered. Aunts, cousins, board members who'd known Adrian his entire life, all of them wearing expressions that ranged from pity to something closer to satisfaction. "This is humiliating," said Aunt Diane, Victor's sister, not bothering to lower her voice, "in front of the entire business council. Do you understand what this does to the family name?" "I understand what it does to me," Adrian said quietly. "Oh, come now." Diane waved a dismissive hand. "You had to see this coming eventually, Adrian. Sophia is a beautiful, ambitious woman. She was always going to end up with whoever could actually provide for her. It was never going to be you, dear. No offense intended." "None taken," Adrian said, though every word landed like a blow. "Since apparently my entire family agrees with her." Damien appeared in the doorway then, Sophia a step behind him. both of them wearing expressions of practiced regret that didn't reach their eyes. "I know this is difficult, little brother," Damien said, "but you should be grateful, honestly. I'm taking responsibility for something you clearly couldn't handle. Sophia deserves stability, the kind of stability that comes with actually inheriting something instead of gambling on a startup that's already failing." "My company isn't failing, isn't it?" Damien's smile was thin, knowing, and entirely too satisfied. "You should check your vendor contracts more carefully, Adrian. Things have a way of falling apart quietly before anyone even notices the cracks." The room went very still. Adrian looked at his stepbrother for a long moment, understanding, with a slow and sickening clarity, exactly whose hands had been behind the vendor cancellations, the sudden withdrawals, the internal restructuring that had made no sense until this exact moment. "You did this," Adrian said quietly. "The contracts, the vendors pulling out, that was you." "I have no idea what you're talking about," Damien said smoothly, and the room predictably chose to believe him. Victor stepped forward, weary, already treating the matter as settled. "Adrian, I think it would be best if you took some time away from the family and from the company's public functions until this settles down, for everyone's sake." "You're choosing him," Adrian said. It wasn't a question. "I'm not choosing anyone," Victor said, in the tone of a man who was doing exactly that. "I'm managing a situation." Adrian looked around the room one final time, at his father, at his aunt, at the extended family who had spent his entire life treating his achievements as inconvenient footnotes to Damien's inevitable inheritance, and understood that there was nothing left in that room for him. "I'll save you the trouble," Adrian said quietly. "I'm leaving." He walked out of the lounge, through the ballroom, past 300 guests who parted for him the way people part for something they'd rather not touch, and out into the cold night air, carrying nothing with him but the ring he never got to give and the sudden, hollow understanding that he had absolutely no one left. The rain started an hour after he left the hotel, and Adrian didn't bother finding shelter. He walked without any real direction, tuxedo soaked through, his grandmother's ring still sitting somewhere on that ballroom floor where he'd left it, the velvet box in his pocket now feeling less like a promise and more like evidence of how thoroughly he'd misjudged his entire life. He ended up on a park bench 3 miles from the hotel in a part of the city he didn't recognize, and simply sat there, letting the rain do what it wanted with him. He didn't notice the black car pull up along the curb. He didn't notice the woman who stepped out of it, an umbrella forgotten in her hand, her expensive evening gown already soaking through as she crossed the wet grass toward him without a single moment's hesitation. "Adrian." He looked up. It took him a long moment to place her, a face he hadn't seen in nearly 2 years. Older now, more composed, but unmistakably the same quiet, watchful woman who used to sit 2 rows behind him in his college economics seminar. "Celeste?" His voice came out rough, disbelieving. "Celeste Ashford?" She knelt in front of him, right there in the wet grass, heedless of the ruined silk of her gown, and looked at him with an expression he couldn't quite name. Something that looked almost like relief and grief and a carefully guarded joy all at once. "I've finally found you," she said quietly. "I don't—" Adrian shook his head, rain running down his face, exhaustion and humiliation making it hard to string thoughts together. "How did you even know where—" "I've had people looking for the last 2 hours," Celeste said simply, as though that explained everything. As though the youngest billionaire CEO in the country dispatching a search team for one heartbroken man on a park bench was the most natural thing in the world. "I saw what happened tonight. Everyone did, eventually. It's already everywhere online." Adrian let out a hollow, humorless laugh. "Great," So you came to see it in person. I came, Celeste said, and something in her voice sharpened, gentle but unmistakably firm. Because I couldn't stand the idea of you sitting alone in the rain after everyone else decided you weren't worth staying for. He looked at her properly then, really looked, and something about the quiet certainty in her expression cut through the numbness enough to let a single memory surface. A bad night during his sophomore year, a girl he barely knew crying alone outside the library, and himself, 18 years old and entirely unremarkable, sitting down beside her without a word and simply staying until she was ready to go back inside. "You're the girl from the library," he said slowly. "Freshman year, I helped you find my brother's letter," Celeste said, and her eyes were bright now, glassy with tears she was visibly, deliberately not letting fall. "The last one he ever wrote me, before the accident. I lost it out of my bag that night, and I was too embarrassed to ask anyone for help finding it in the dark. You didn't even ask me what was wrong. You just got down on your knees in the wet grass outside the library and helped me look until we found it." Adrian stared at her, memory and present colliding in a way that made his chest ache in an entirely new direction. "You remember that," he said quietly, "after all these years." "I remember everything," Celeste said, and there was something raw and unguarded underneath the words now. Something she'd clearly kept carefully hidden for a very long time. "You once saved me without even knowing it. Let me save you now." Adrian looked down at his soaked, ruined tuxedo, at the empty velvet box he could feel through the fabric of his jacket, at the wreckage of the only future he'd ever planned for himself. "I don't have anything left, Celeste," he said. "No company left worth saving, no family, nothing." "I'm not offering you charity," Celeste said, standing and extending her hand to him, rain still falling steadily around them. "And I'm not offering you pity. I'm offering you somewhere to breathe for as long as you need it. What you do after that is entirely up to you." Adrian looked at her outstretched hand for a long moment, a stranger who wasn't quite a stranger, offering him something he didn't yet understand he desperately needed. Slowly, he reached out and took it. The Ashford penthouse occupied the top 3 floors of a glass tower overlooking the river, and Adrian stood in the entryway the next morning in borrowed clothes, feeling profoundly out of place amid floor-to-ceiling windows and furniture that probably cost more than his entire apartment. "You're staring at the coffee machine like it insulted you," Celeste said, appearing in the kitchen doorway in a simple sweater, hair still damp from a shower, looking nothing like the composed billionaire CEO whose face occasionally appeared on business news segments Adrian had half-watched over the years. "I've just never seen one with a touchscreen," Adrian admitted. "I wasn't sure if it needed a login. It's needlessly complicated. I complain about it constantly and never replace it." She moved past him, tapped a few buttons with practiced efficiency, and set a cup in front of him a moment later. "Black, no sugar. That's still how you take it, right?" Adrian blinked. "How did you know that?" Something flickered across Celeste's expression, a beat too long, a fraction too careful. "Lucky guess," she said, and turned back toward the counter before he could examine it further. They ate breakfast in a silence that wasn't quite comfortable yet, both of them navigating the strange etiquette of 2 near strangers occupying the same unfamiliar space. Adrian kept his answers short, polite, edged with the particular exhaustion of a man who'd lost everything 12 hours earlier and hadn't yet figured out how to exist inside that loss. "You don't have to perform gratitude at me," Celeste said eventually, watching him thank her for the 3rd time over something as small as passing the cream. "I didn't bring you here so you could apologize for existing in my kitchen." "Sorry," Adrian said automatically, then caught himself, and something almost like a real, tired laugh escaped him. Force of habit, apparently. "I noticed." Celeste's gaze softened. "You don't need to earn your place here, Adrian. There's no invoice coming. He looked at her for a long moment, genuinely looked, the way exhaustion sometimes strips away the instinct to perform politeness and simply leaves the truth sitting there instead. I don't know how to just exist somewhere, he admitted quietly, without trying to prove I deserve to. I know, Celeste said, and something about the certainty in her voice suggested she'd thought about this particular truth of his for far longer than one night could explain. We can work on that. There's no deadline. He didn't ask her again how she'd known so many small, specific things about him. The coffee order, the way he apologized reflexively, the particular quality of guilt he carried into rooms he hadn't earned entry to. Some part of him understood distantly that examining it too closely right now would require more emotional bandwidth than he currently possessed. Instead, for the first time since the ballroom, Adrian let himself simply sit in a quiet kitchen, drinking coffee made exactly the way he liked it, across from a woman who didn't seem to want anything from him at all. It was, he realized somewhere in the middle of that silence, the first time in longer than he could remember that he'd actually felt himself breathing normally. Celeste noticed it too. The small, unguarded moment where something in his shoulders finally loosened and said nothing, watching him quietly over the rim of her own cup, careful not to let him see exactly how much that first genuine smile of his, however faint, meant to her after 2 years of waiting. 3 weeks into staying at the Ashford penthouse, Adrian found himself standing in Celeste's office at Ashford International, staring at a stack of documents she'd slid across her desk toward him. I'm not asking you to work for me, Celeste said before he could object. I'm asking you to work with me. There's a difference. On what exactly? A logistics and infrastructure venture? Something adjacent to what you were already building at Hayes Innovations before... She paused delicately. Before everything. Ashford International provides the capital and the platform. You provide the vision. Equal partnership structured properly with your name on it just as much as mine. Adrian studied the documents for a long moment, old instincts warring with newer, more exhausted ones. Why would you do this? You don't need my company. You don't need me professionally. Maybe I want to, Celeste said simply. Is that so difficult to accept? He didn't have a good answer for that, and so, slowly, cautiously, he started saying yes to things, to meetings, to strategy sessions that ran late into the evening, to a version of ambition that didn't feel like it was constantly trying to outrun his own inadequacy. Something shifted in those weeks. Adrian started noticing things about Celeste the way she'd apparently been noticing things about him for years, the way she forgot to eat when a deal consumed her attention, the way her composed CEO voice softened, almost imperceptibly, whenever they were alone in a room together, the careful, deliberate way she always left him room to make his own decisions instead of simply making them for him. Their new venture, still unnamed, began taking shape faster than either of them expected, built on a foundation of Adrian's original ideas, refined and expanded with resources he'd never had access to before, but unmistakably still his. Late one evening, working side by side at her dining table surrounded by scattered documents, Adrian looked up to find Celeste watching him with an expression she hadn't quite managed to smooth back into professional neutrality in time. What? He asked. Nothing, she said, looking back down at her laptop a beat too quickly. You just look different than you did 3 weeks ago. Different how? Like someone who remembers what it feels like to want things again, Celeste said quietly, instead of just surviving them. Adrian sat with that for a moment, surprised by how accurately it landed. Across the city, in a penthouse far less warm than the one Adrian now occupied, Sophia Lancaster sat in front of a television, watching a business news segment cover the surprise formation of a new venture between Ashford International and an unnamed rising entrepreneur. Footage briefly catching Adrian's face, healthier and steadier than she'd seen him look in months, standing beside Celeste Ashford with an ease that made something cold settle low in Sophia's stomach. "That's Adrian," she said quietly, to no one, staring at the screen. Damien, seated across the room, didn't even look up from his phone. "It won't last. He has nothing to build with." But Sophia kept watching the screen long after the segment ended, unable to shake the growing, uncomfortable feeling that she'd made a catastrophic miscalculation about exactly how replaceable Adrian Hayes actually was. The invitation arrived at Lancaster Holdings on cream cardstock, embossed with the Ashford International crest. An invitation to a product launch event, the kind of business gathering Sophia would once have attended purely to be seen at Damien's side. She almost didn't go. Then she saw Adrian's name listed as co-founder, and something she couldn't quite name made her reach for the invitation instead of setting it aside. The launch was smaller than the galas she was used to, but sharper, more deliberate, the kind of event built around genuine substance rather than spectacle. Sophia found a quiet corner near the back of the room and watched Adrian field questions from a small crowd of investors with an ease and confidence she'd never once seen from him during their entire relationship. "He looks good," she said quietly, mostly to herself. "Temporary," said a voice beside her. Damien had followed her in, uninvited, watching the stage with a tight, unreadable expression. "Ashford's propping him up. The moment her attention moves elsewhere, he'll fold. He always folds." "Does he?" Sophia asked, and something in her own voice surprised her, a note of genuine uncertainty she hadn't expected to feel. On stage, Celeste stepped up beside Adrian to field a technical question, and the easy, natural way they exchanged a glance before she answered it. No visible hierarchy, no performance, just two people who trusted each other completely, struck Sophia harder than she wanted to admit. She thought, unwillingly, of every dinner she and Adrian had shared during his early startup years, of every night she'd complained, gently but persistently, about the modest apartment and the years of sacrifice and the future she felt owed rather than one she was building alongside him. She'd told herself for years that she deserved more than what Adrian could offer. Watching him now, effortlessly commanding a room full of people who clearly respected him, she felt something small and uncomfortable crack open in her chest. Damien's phone buzzed. He glanced at it, frowned, and excused himself abruptly, muttering something about a call he needed to take. Sophia stayed a moment longer, watching Celeste rest a hand briefly on Adrian's arm as the crowd began to disperse. A small, unremarkable gesture between business partners, except that Sophia recognized with a sinking feeling she didn't yet have words for, that it wasn't only business. "That should have been ordinary," she murmured to herself. "That should have been us." She left before Adrian could see her in the crowd, unwilling to examine too closely why the sight of him thriving without her felt so much worse than the sight of him falling apart ever had. It happened on a quiet evening, weeks later in the Ashford penthouse living room, rain tapping steadily against the windows in a way that reminded Adrian, not unpleasantly, of the night they'd met on that park bench. "Can I ask you something?" Adrian said, setting down the files he'd been reviewing. "And I want an actual answer, not a deflection." Celeste looked up from her own laptop, something careful entering her expression.
All right. Why me? He asked. You could have done business with anyone. You could have invested in 100 other ventures with less baggage attached. Why did you specifically come looking for me that night? Why does none of this ever feel transactional the way it should, given how much you've put into it? Celeste was quiet for a long moment, setting her laptop aside entirely, some visible internal debate playing out behind her eyes before she finally spoke. Because I've loved you since college, she said quietly, since before either of us had any money or any reason for the world to pay attention to us. Since a night in the rain outside the library when you sat down next to a stranger and didn't ask her a single question, just stayed until she felt less alone. Adrian went very still. I never told you, Celeste continued, her voice steady but carrying a rawness that suggested years of careful restraint finally giving way. You were with Sophia by the time I worked up the nerve to even consider it, and you loved her so completely that I told myself it would be selfish to interfere. So I buried it. I built a company. I told myself I'd made peace with watching from a distance. A small, humorless laugh. And then the news broke about what happened to you that night. And I realized I'd spent 2 years convincing myself that loving you quietly was enough. When the truth is, I've just been waiting for a reason to stop staying silent. Celeste, I'm not telling you this because I expect anything back, she said quickly, some of her composure cracking slightly around the edges. I know you're still healing. I know Sophia is still a wound that hasn't closed. I just didn't want to keep being someone who loves you from behind a carefully maintained distance. Not anymore. Adrian sat with it for a long moment, the rain still tapping steadily against the windows, memories rearranging themselves into a new and startling shape. Every small, specific kindness over the last 2 months, the coffee order she shouldn't have known, the quiet way she'd always left him room to rebuild himself instead of rebuilding him herself, suddenly making complete, overwhelming sense. He thought of Sophia, of 4 years spent believing love meant constant sacrifice in one direction. He thought of a woman who had loved him in silence for 2 years, asking for nothing, offering everything, simply because she'd once watched him be kind to a stranger and had never been able to let that memory go. Adrian crossed the room and without a word pulled Celeste into a hug, the first one either of them had allowed themselves, careful and a little uncertain but entirely real. Thank you, he said quietly into her hair, for not staying quiet forever. Celeste closed her eyes, holding on, years of restraint finally, quietly, coming undone.
The weeks after Celeste's confession settled into something neither of them rushed to name, but both of them quietly began to build toward. Movie nights became a fixture. Celeste, it turned out, had never seen most of the classic films Adrian had grown up loving, and he took an unreasonable amount of joy in narrating plot points she should have already guessed. Somewhere during the third film, in as many weeks, she'd stopped sitting a careful distance away and started leaning almost absently against his shoulder, and neither of them acknowledged it out loud. "You're doing the thing again," Adrian said one evening, glancing sideways at her. "What thing?" "Pretending you're not stealing my hoodie." Celeste looked down at the oversized gray fabric she was currently wearing, feigning innocence with a poorly concealed smile. "It's warm, that's all." "It's also mine, and you've been wearing it for 4 days." "It smells like you," she admitted, quieter, and something in her voice made his chest ache in a way that had stopped feeling unfamiliar weeks ago. I didn't realize how much I'd missed that until I had it. He started cooking for her in return,
clumsy at first, then gradually more confident, learning her actual habits instead of the ones he'd assumed a billionaire CEO would have. He noticed she skipped meals entirely when a deal consumed her attention and started simply leaving plates beside her laptop without comment, watching her eat almost on autopilot while still reading contracts, a small, unconscious smile tugging at her mouth every time. One evening, after closing a difficult negotiation together, they ended up on the penthouse balcony, city lights spread out beneath them, a bottle of wine neither of them had touched much of, sitting forgotten on the railing. "Dance with me," Celeste said suddenly, setting down her glass. "There's no music." "There doesn't need to be." He laughed, but he took her hand anyway, and they swayed slowly under the string of balcony lights. No real rhythm guiding them beyond the quiet, unhurried comfort of simply being close to each other. Adrian found himself watching her face in the low light. The way her carefully composed CEO expression had entirely dissolved into something soft and unguarded, something she clearly reserved only for moments like this one. "Can I ask you something?" he said quietly. "Always. Are you happy with all of this? With me still healing, still figuring out who I am without everything I lost?" Celeste stopped swaying, tilting her head up to look at him directly. "Adrian, I've been happy since the moment you took my hand in that park. Everything since then has just been additional happiness I didn't know I was allowed to have." He kissed her then, the first time either of them had allowed it. Careful, unhurried. Years of waiting finally given somewhere to land. When they broke apart, Celeste was smiling in a way he hadn't seen from her before, something entirely unguarded and completely certain. "I've been waiting a long time for that," she admitted softly. "I know," Adrian said. "I'm sorry it took me so long to catch up."
The Royal Auction Hall glittered with the particular restraint of old money. No flashing cameras allowed inside. Just quiet, discreet wealth, bidding on pieces most attendees would never actually display, purely for the satisfaction of having won them. Damien had specifically requested an invitation, and everyone in attendance understood, without anyone saying it directly, that tonight was meant to be a demonstration. Damien Hayes reasserting his dominance in a room full of people who mattered, with Sophia on his arm as visible proof of his triumph. Adrian arrived with Celeste beside him, and the room's collective attention shifted, subtly but unmistakably, the moment they walked in. "He's actually here," Damien muttered to Sophia, watching Adrian move through the crowd with an ease that grated on him more than he wanted to admit. The auction began with minor pieces, sculptures, rare first editions, a scattering of jewelry, and Adrian found himself, almost without meaning to, commenting quietly to Celeste about a particular painting near the third lot, an understated impressionist landscape that reminded him, he admitted, of a print his mother used to keep before she passed. Celeste said nothing. 3 lots later, when the painting came up for bid, she raised her paddle without hesitation and secured it within 30 seconds, the room murmuring at the size of the winning bid. "You didn't have to do that," Adrian said quietly, once the gavel fell. "Did you like it? That's not the point." "Did you like it?" she repeated, and there was something amused and utterly unbothered in her expression. "Yes." "Then it was worth it," Celeste said simply, and turned back toward the stage as if the matter was entirely settled. It happened 3 more times over the course of the evening. A first edition novel Adrian mentioned reading in college, a small antique clock that reminded him of one his grandmother used to own, a modest but beautifully crafted chess set he lingered near for exactly 4 seconds too long. Each time, Celeste secured it without visible hesitation, asking him only the same quiet question every time. Do you like it? Sophia watched from across the room, something twisting tighter in her chest with every winning bid. She remembered, with a clarity she hadn't invited, a modest silver necklace Adrian had saved for months to buy her during their second year together. A necklace she'd worn twice, then left in a drawer, telling him privately that she'd expected something finer someday, once his company actually succeeded. She hadn't understood until this exact moment. Watching Celeste ask, "Do you like it?" with such simple, unguarded sincerity, what it actually felt like to be loved for what mattered to you, rather than what you could eventually provide. The final lot of the evening was a masterwork, a rare, museum-quality piece that had drawn interest from collectors across the country. Damien bid aggressively, visibly determined to win at least one thing in a room where he'd spent the entire evening watching his stepbrother quietly, effortlessly outshine him. Celeste raised her paddle once, calmly, for an amount that made the entire room go still. Damien didn't bid again. The gavel fell, and Celeste Ashford had won the evening's final masterpiece without ever once raising her voice, standing beside a man the room had, only months earlier, considered thoroughly finished. The final piece of the auction, once the masterwork painting had been settled and carried away, turned out to be a late addition. A diamond necklace, so rare that the auctioneer had saved it deliberately for last, building anticipation across the entire evening. It was, by every account, whispered around the room, one of the most valuable pieces to ever appear at the Royal Auction Hall. Celeste won it with the same calm, unhurried certainty she'd shown all evening, and a murmur of anticipation rippled through the crowd as the case was carried up and presented to her. The assumption, unspoken but universal, that a piece this rare belonged in Celeste Ashford's private collection, a trophy befitting one of the wealthiest women in the country. Instead, Celeste opened the case, lifted the necklace out herself, and turned toward Adrian. "Adrian," she said, loud enough for the room to hear, "I want you to have this." A ripple of stunned silence moved through the crowd. Even the auctioneer paused, visibly caught off guard. "Celeste, I can't." "You can," she said gently, stepping closer, fastening the necklace's velvet case into his hand rather than around her own throat. "Not because it's valuable. I don't care what it's worth on paper. I want you to have something that's entirely, unquestionably yours. Something no one can ever take away from you the way everything else was taken." Adrian stared down at the case in his hands, something thick rising in his throat that had nothing to do with the diamonds inside it. "Everyone's staring," he said quietly. "Let them," Celeste said, unbothered. "I've spent my entire life being told what I should want, what I should collect, what I should be seen holding. For the first time, I actually get to give something to someone because it means something, not because it photographs well." Across the room, Sophia stood frozen, watching the exchange with an expression she couldn't quite control anymore. She thought, unwillingly, of a small velvet box Adrian had once handed her during their second year together. A modest silver necklace, nothing close to what stood in that case now, purchased after 4 months of careful saving from a startup budget that could barely cover his own rent. She remembered opening it in their cramped apartment kitchen, remembered the specific hollow disappointment she hadn't bothered to hide, the offhand comment she'd made about hoping for something a little more substantial eventually. She remembered wearing it exactly twice before it disappeared into the back of a drawer and Adrian never once bringing it up again, never once making her feel guilty for the reaction he surely must have noticed. Watching Celeste hand over a piece worth more than most people's entire lives, framed not as a trophy, but as an act of pure devotion, Sophia understood with sudden, sickening clarity that she'd once been handed something far more valuable than diamonds and had thrown it away over the absence of a price tag. "Are you all right?" Damien asked beside her, noticing her stillness. "Fine," Sophia said, though her voice didn't sound fine at all, even to herself. She excused herself shortly after, retreating to the restroom, gripping the edge of the marble sink as the weight of the evening finally caught up to her. The growing, suffocating realization that the man she'd dismissed as unable to provide for her had simply, quietly, never needed anyone's approval to know exactly how to love someone. She stared at her own reflection for a long time, unable to shake the feeling that regret, once it truly took hold, didn't announce itself loudly. It simply settled in, permanent and unwelcome, and refused to leave. 3 weeks later, the Hayes Group's annual gala at the Grand Imperial Hotel drew nearly identical guests to the disastrous engagement party months earlier. Except this time, Adrian walked in not as the family's quiet disappointment, but as Celeste Ashford's business partner and publicly acknowledged guest of honor, their joint venture now one of the most talked-about developments in the city's financial press. Damien found them near the bar within the first 20 minutes, his charm dialed up to its most practiced setting. Celeste. He offered his most disarming smile, sliding into the space beside her with practiced ease. "It's been too long. You look stunning tonight, as always." Celeste didn't turn to face him fully. "Damien, I hear the new venture is doing well. Impressive, honestly, given how quickly you two put it together." His eyes flicked briefly toward Adrian, something calculating beneath the charm. "Though I suppose you've always had an eye for undervalued opportunities." "Careful," Celeste said mildly, still not fully turning toward him. "You're talking about my partner." "Business partner, or something more?" Damien pressed, leaning slightly closer, his tone shifting into something more overtly flirtatious. "I only ask because I'd hate to see someone like you tied up in something as unstable as—" Celeste turned then, finally, and looked at him with an expression so coolly unbothered that Damien's sentence trailed off entirely. Without another word to him, she crossed the small distance to where Adrian stood, slid a hand along his jaw, and kissed him, unhurried, entirely unbothered by the cluster of phones that immediately rose around them, entirely certain of exactly what she was communicating and to whom. When she pulled back, she turned to the small crowd that had gathered, Damien still standing awkwardly a few feet away, and said clearly, warmly, without a trace of hesitation, "Everyone, I'd like you to officially meet my boyfriend, Adrian Hayes." A ripple of murmurs spread through the gala, phones capturing the moment from every angle, the story already halfway to viral before the band had even finished the current song. Damien stood frozen, his earlier confidence draining visibly from his expression as he realized, in real time, exactly how thoroughly and publicly he'd just been dismissed, not through anger, not through confrontation, but through the simple, devastating indifference of a woman who hadn't even considered him worth a proper response. Sophia, watching from a few feet away, saw something in Damien's face she'd never seen before. Not irritation, but genuine rattled humiliation, the first visible crack in the composure he'd spent his entire life perfecting. "That's embarrassing," someone murmured nearby, not quite quietly enough. Damien forced a thin smile, muttered something about needing to greet other guests, and retreated toward the bar with considerably less confidence than he'd arrived with, the sound of scattered, badly concealed laughter following him across the room. Adrian, still faintly stunned by the kiss and the words that followed it, looked down at Celeste with something warm and disbelieving in his expression. "Boyfriend," he repeated softly. "Was that all right?" she asked, a flicker of genuine uncertainty breaking through her composure for just a moment. "It was perfect," Adrian said, and kissed her again, entirely unbothered by the phone still capturing every second of it. The first attack came disguised as routine due diligence. Adrian noticed it 3 days after the gala, a sudden regulatory inquiry into their venture's supply chain compliance, filed anonymously, vague enough to require a full internal audit, but specific enough to freeze 2 pending contracts while the review played out. "This has Damien's fingerprints all over it," Ray said, sliding the inquiry notice across Adrian's desk. "It's exactly the kind of move he pulled on Hayes Innovations. Same pattern, dressed up slightly differently." "I know," Adrian said, already pulling up their compliance records. "The difference is, this time I actually have the resources to fight back properly." Celeste arrived within the hour, having heard about the inquiry through her own legal team before Adrian had even finished reading it himself. "He's getting desperate," she said, scanning the filing with a calm, focused expression that Adrian had come to recognize as her most dangerous one. "This is sloppy. Whoever filed it didn't cover the source well enough." "Can you trace it?" "I already have someone on it." She set the filing down. "Adrian, I want you to understand something. Whatever Damien throws at this company, we handle it together. Not because you can't handle it alone, you clearly can, but because you shouldn't have to prove that to me or to anyone ever again." Within a week, their legal team demonstrated the inquiry had been filed using fabricated data, tracing the anonymous source back to a shell account with tenuous but ultimately traceable ties to Hayes Group's internal compliance department. The regulatory board dismissed the inquiry entirely, and Adrian's company resumed its paused contracts within days, stronger for having weathered the attempt. Damien tried again 2 weeks later, a smear campaign this time, an anonymous tip to a financial journalist suggesting Adrian's venture was quietly mismanaging investor funds. Celeste's communications team had it debunked and retracted within 48 hours, the journalist issuing an unusually direct correction after Celeste's legal team provided airtight documentation disproving every claim. Each failed attempt left Damien slightly more exposed, slightly more reckless, slightly less careful about covering his tracks. "He's not thinking clearly anymore," Ray observed during a strategy session 3 weeks into the escalating attempts. "Every move he makes is bigger and sloppier than the last. It's like he can't stand watching this succeed, and it's making him careless." "That's exactly what's happening," Celeste said. "He spent his entire life being untouchable because no one ever pushed back hard enough to make him careless. Now someone finally is." Adrian sat back, studying the pattern laid out across the conference table. Inquiry, smear campaign, a third attempted vendor interference that had failed even faster than the first 2. "He's not going to stop," Adrian said quietly, "not until he's out of moves entirely." "Then let's make sure he runs out of moves faster than he expects," Celeste said, already reaching for her tablet, already 3 steps ahead of whatever Damien intended to try next. For the first time in the entire ordeal, Adrian felt something unfamiliar settle into his chest as he watched Celeste work. Not fear of what Damien might attempt, but a quiet, growing confidence that whatever came next, he wasn't facing it the way he'd faced everything else in his life. He wasn't facing it alone. The evidence, when it finally surfaced, didn't come from Celeste's legal team at all. It came from Ray, who had spent weeks quietly digging through years of old Hayes Innovations records, searching for the original source of the vendor cancellations that had crippled Adrian's first company months before the engagement ever collapsed. "I found it," Ray said, appearing in Adrian's office late one evening, laptop already open. "Forged authorization documents. Someone used Adrian's digital signature, poorly replicated but close enough to fool automated systems, to cancel 4 vendor contracts 8 months before the engagement party. The IP address traces back to a private server registered under a shell company."
Let me guess, Adrian said quietly. Damien. Damien, Ray confirmed. It's all here. Years of it, actually. Once you know what you're looking for. He didn't just sabotage the vendor contracts. There are forged internal memos dating back nearly 3 years, systematically undermining every opportunity that came your way before it could fully develop. Celeste, reviewing the files over Adrian's shoulder, went very still. This is enough to bring to Victor directly. He won't believe it, Adrian said. He spent his entire life refusing to see anything wrong with Damien. Then we make it impossible for him not to, Celeste said. The meeting with Victor Hayes took place 3 days later, in his private study at Hayes Manor, the same house where Adrian had once been told, in no uncertain terms, that he should be grateful his brother was willing to take responsibility for the woman he loved. Victor read through the evidence in silence, his expression shifting slowly from irritation to confusion to something that looked, for the first time in Adrian's memory, like genuine alarm. This can't be accurate, Victor said, though his voice lacked its usual certainty. Damien wouldn't. The forged signature matches 4 separate incidents across 3 years, Celeste said calmly, sliding another document across the desk. Independent forensic analysis confirms the digital fingerprints. This isn't speculation, Mr. Hayes. This is documented, verifiable fraud committed against your own son. Victor stared at the documents for a long time, something in his composure visibly cracking as he worked through years of memories he'd apparently never once questioned. Every conveniently timed setback in Adrian's career, every subtle undermining he dismissed as bad luck or inevitable inadequacy. I always believed Damien was simply the stronger of the 2 of you, Victor said quietly, more to himself than to either of them. I never once considered that he might have needed to cheat to stay ahead. You didn't want to consider it, Adrian said, without cruelty, simply stating a fact both of them had lived inside for years. It was easier to believe I just wasn't good enough. Victor didn't argue. He simply sat there, staring at evidence that dismantled nearly a decade of assumptions, the weight of his own complicity settling visibly onto his shoulders. By the following morning, Victor had quietly authorized an internal investigation into Damien's conduct, informing the Hayes Group board of serious concerns regarding fraud and corporate sabotage. Word spread through the family within hours. Aunts, cousins, board members who had spent years dismissing Adrian suddenly recalibrating everything they thought they'd understood about which brother actually deserved their loyalty. By the end of the week, regulatory investigators had opened a formal inquiry into Damien Hayes' conduct at Hayes Group, the first official crack in an empire he'd spent his entire life believing was untouchable. Scene 15. Everything he lost. Sophia arrived at Adrian's office without an appointment, which his assistant informed him twice, apologetically, before Adrian finally told her it was fine to let her in. She looked different than she had at the gala, less composed, the careful polish she'd always maintained in public noticeably absent, replaced by something rawer and more uncertain. "I wasn't sure you'd see me," Sophia said, standing just inside the doorway. "I wasn't sure either," Adrian admitted, "but I don't think avoiding this conversation does either of us any favors." She sat across from him, hands folded tightly in her lap, and for a long moment simply didn't speak, as though the apology she'd rehearsed had abandoned her the moment she actually needed it. "I made the biggest mistake of my life," she said finally, quietly. "I don't expect you to forgive me. I'm not even sure I'm asking you to. I just needed you to hear it directly instead of finding out secondhand that I finally understood what I actually threw away." "What changed?" Adrian asked, his voice calm, curious rather than accusatory. "You seemed very certain of your decision that night." I was certain of a lot of things that night that I've since had to unlearn, Sophia said. I told myself security mattered more than loyalty. I told myself Damien could give me a life that you couldn't. I watched you struggle for years and convinced myself that struggle meant failure instead of understanding it was just the cost of building something real. Her voice cracked slightly. I watched Celeste hand you a fortune in diamonds like it meant nothing to her, and I understood for the first time that I'd had something worth more than any of that sitting in my hands for years, and I threw it in a drawer because it didn't look expensive enough. Adrian listened without interrupting, without softening his expression into forgiveness he didn't yet feel, but without cruelty either. I loved you, Adrian, Sophia continued. I know that's hard to believe, given everything. But somewhere along the way, I convinced myself that love needed to come with guarantees, and I chose the guarantee instead of the person. I've regretted it every single day since. I believe you, Adrian said quietly once she'd finished. I believe you loved me in whatever way you were capable of at the time. I also believe that the person who threw my grandmother's ring on a ballroom floor in front of 300 people wasn't someone I recognize as the woman I spent 4 years building a life with. Sophia flinched, but didn't argue. I'm not angry anymore, Adrian said, and found, saying it out loud, that it was actually true. For a long time I was. But I think I understand something now that I didn't understand back then. He paused, something quietly resolute settling into his expression. Thank you, Sophia, genuinely, because losing you led me to the woman who truly loves me, completely, without conditions, without needing me to prove I deserved it first. Sophia's composure finally broke entirely, tears spilling freely now, years of carefully maintained certainty collapsing all at once. I'm happy for you, she managed. I mean that. I just wish I'd understood what I had before it was too late to keep it. I hope you find whatever it is you're actually looking for, Adrian said, standing, his tone gentle but final. I hope it turns out to be something more honest than what you were chasing before. He walked her to the door, and as it closed behind her, Sophia stood alone in the hallway outside his office, watching through the glass as Celeste arrived moments later, greeted by Adrian with an easy, unguarded warmth that had never once existed between Sophia and the man she'd left behind. She watched them walk away together, hand in hand, disappearing down the hallway without a single backward glance, and understood, with a finality that felt like grief, that whatever chance she'd once had was gone permanently, buried beneath years of choices she could never undo. Damien's final scheme was, by any reasonable measure, an act of desperation. With the internal investigation closing in and his position at Hayes Group growing more precarious by the week, he arranged for a story to leak at the city's most prestigious annual charity gala, a fabricated claim suggesting Adrian's venture with Ashford International had been built on stolen intellectual property originally developed at Hayes Innovations, positioning Damien as the wronged party rather than the exposed one. He chose the gala deliberately, certain that a public reveal in front of the city's elite would cement the narrative before anyone had time to properly investigate the claim. It went wrong within minutes of him raising it. I think everyone here deserves to know, Damien announced, loudly enough to draw attention from a cluster of nearby guests, that the celebrated new venture between Ashford International and my former stepbrother was built on intellectual property that rightfully belongs to Hayes Group. The room's attention shifted, murmurs rippling outward, exactly as Damien had intended. What he hadn't accounted for was Celeste's legal team already present at the gala,
already briefed on the regulatory investigation's near-complete findings, stepping forward within moments to formally and publicly correct the record. "That claim is not only false," Celeste's lead counsel said calmly, addressing the gathering crowd directly. "It's demonstrably false, given that forensic evidence already submitted to regulatory investigators shows the opposite is true. Mr. Hayes here systematically sabotaged his stepbrother's original venture using forged authorization documents, a pattern of fraud stretching back nearly 3 years." A hush fell over the gathered crowd. "This is absurd," Damien said, his composure cracking visibly. "These are baseless accusations." "They're not baseless," Victor Hayes said, stepping forward from where he'd been standing quietly near the back of the gathering crowd, his expression heavy but resolute. "I've seen the evidence myself. I've cooperated with the investigation. My son's claims tonight are not only false, they're a continuation of exactly the fraud he's already under formal investigation for." The room's reaction shifted instantly and irreversibly, from curious murmurs to open, unconcealed shock, phones rising throughout the gala to capture Damien's public unraveling in real time. "Dad!" Damien started, but Victor's expression had already hardened into something final. "You're finished, Damien," Victor said quietly, the weight of years of blind favoritism audible beneath the exhaustion in his voice. "I should have seen this a long time ago. I'm sorry it took this long." Security arrived within minutes, discreetly but unmistakably escorting Damien from the gala floor, under the watchful gaze of the same elite social circle he'd spent his entire life performing superiority for. His composure had entirely abandoned him by the time he reached the exit, his face a mixture of fury and disbelief, the golden reputation he'd built his whole life around dissolving in real time in front of everyone who'd once admired it. Sophia watched the entire scene unfold from near the bar, frozen, understanding with absolute clarity that the man she'd chosen over Adrian, the man she'd believed represented security and status, had just been publicly stripped of everything that had ever made him seem worth choosing. She didn't move to follow him. She simply stood there, watching Damien disappear through the gala's grand entrance in disgrace, and felt, beneath the shock, something that almost resembled relief that she hadn't married into whatever collapse was still coming for him. Across the room, Adrian stood beside Celeste, watching quietly, feeling no satisfaction in the spectacle beyond a quiet, settled sense that the truth had finally, unavoidably, caught up to the person who'd spent years running from it. The university campus looked smaller than Adrian remembered, the way places from your past always do once enough time has passed to change your sense of scale. He'd asked Celeste to come with him without explaining why, and she'd agreed easily, the way she agreed to most things he asked of her lately, with a quiet trust that had taken months to fully settle into, but now felt as natural as breathing. "Why here?" she asked, as they walked across the quad toward the old economics building, autumn leaves scattered across a path they'd both once walked separately, years before either of them understood how much the other would eventually matter. "You'll see," Adrian said. He led her toward a wide, gnarled oak tree near the edge of the quad, the same tree he'd confirmed with a quiet, nostalgic search through old class schedules that stood almost exactly between the library where they'd first crossed paths and the economics building where Celeste had once sat 2 rows behind him, watching him more closely than he'd ever realized. "We probably walked past each other under this exact tree 100 times, Adrian said, stopping beneath its branches, both completely unaware of what we'd eventually mean to each other. Celeste looked up at the tree, something soft and reflective crossing her expression. "I used to sit over there," she said,
gesturing toward a bench nearby. During my first year, when I didn't know anyone yet, I used to watch people walk past and wonder what their lives looked like. I remember watching you once, actually. You were arguing animatedly with someone about a group project, completely unaware anyone was paying attention. You never told me that. There's a lot I never told you, Celeste said, smiling. For a very long time. Adrian reached into his jacket, and Celeste's breath caught as she recognized immediately the shape of what he was withdrawing. I bought a ring once before, Adrian said, kneeling slowly beneath the old oak tree, for someone I thought I understood love with. I never got to give it to her, and for a long time I thought that meant something had gone permanently wrong in my life. He opened the small box, a modest but carefully chosen ring catching the afternoon light. I understand now that it just meant the right person hadn't found me yet. Celeste's hands rose to cover her mouth, tears already gathering. You found me in the rain when I had absolutely nothing left to offer anyone, Adrian continued. You loved me quietly for years before you ever said a word about it, and you've never once asked me to be anyone other than exactly who I am. I don't want to spend the rest of my life wondering what it would have been like to actually ask you this properly. He drew a breath. Celeste Ashford, will you marry me? She was laughing and crying at once by the time he finished the question, dropping to her knees in front of him instead of waiting for him to stand, pulling him into a fierce, unguarded embrace before she'd even given him a verbal answer. I've been waiting years to hear that, she said finally, pulling back just enough to look at him properly. Yes, obviously, completely, entirely yes. Above them, the old oak tree swayed gently in the autumn breeze, standing exactly where it always had, having quietly witnessed the beginning of something neither of them had recognized the first time they'd walked beneath it. The wedding took place on a clear spring afternoon, in a garden ceremony deliberately smaller and quieter than either of their public profiles might have suggested. Celeste's insistence, once she'd understood that Adrian had spent his entire life surrounded by grand, performative gatherings that had never once made him feel genuinely seen. The guest list was short and deliberate. Ray stood as Adrian's best man, beaming through most of the ceremony. Evelyn Ashford sat in the front row, dabbing quietly at her eyes, having waited years to watch her granddaughter finally stop hiding behind quiet competence and simply be happy out loud. Victor Hayes attended, seated toward the back, his presence more subdued than his usual public appearances. A man, still working through the weight of years spent favoring the wrong son, watching now with an expression that mixed genuine pride with a regret he'd likely carry for the rest of his life. Sophia did not attend. She sent no message, offered no explanation, and Adrian found, watching Celeste walk toward him down the garden aisle, that he didn't spend a single moment wondering why. The ceremony itself was simple, vows exchanged beneath a floral arch, reminiscent deliberately of the old oak tree where he'd proposed, a small nod neither of them needed to explain to anyone else in attendance. I promise to never ask you to earn the love I give you, Celeste said during her vows, her voice steady despite the emotion clearly underneath it. I promise to keep choosing you loudly, publicly, and without hesitation for exactly as long as you will have me. I promise, Adrian said when it was his turn, to remember every single day that love isn't something you have to sacrifice yourself to deserve. You taught me that. I intend to spend the rest of my life proving I actually learned it. They exchanged rings beneath a sky entirely clear of the rain that had once marked the lowest night of Adrian's life. And when the officiant finally pronounced them married, the small garden erupted into genuine, unguarded celebration, rather than the performative applause Adrian had grown up associating with his family's public gatherings. Later that evening, during the reception, Adrian found a quiet moment alone with his father near the edge of the garden. "I owe you an apology. I don't think we'll ever feel like enough," Victor said quietly, watching Celeste laugh with Evelyn a short distance away. "I spent years failing to see you clearly, Adrian. I'm sorry it took losing everything for me to finally understand what I had in front of me the whole time." "I appreciate that," Adrian said. "I mean that genuinely, but I think I've stopped needing that apology to know my own worth. I learned that somewhere else this year." Victor nodded, something quietly grateful in his expression, and didn't push further. As the evening wound down, Adrian found Celeste near the garden's edge, watching the last of the sunset settle over the trees, and slipped his arms around her from behind, resting his chin lightly against her shoulder. "Regrets?" he asked quietly. "Only that I waited so long to say something," Celeste admitted, leaning back into him. "You?" "None," Adrian said. "Everything that happened, the betrayal, the humiliation, losing everything I thought mattered, led me back to a park bench in the rain, and to you. I wouldn't trade that path for a version of my life that skipped the pain and missed you entirely." They stood together in comfortable silence as the last light faded from the garden, no longer defined by everything they'd lost, but by the quiet, steady life they'd built instead. Not out of revenge, not out of proving anyone wrong, but simply out of two people who had finally, fully chosen each other. Hand in hand, they walked back toward their waiting guests, toward a future neither of them needed to rehearse or perform for anyone else's approval, simply theirs entirely, for as long as they both chose to keep building it together.